My sister stood up at our Thanksgiving table, raised her expensive crystal glass, and proudly announced to the entire room that our father had secretly given her the multi-million-dollar company I built from the absolute ground up since I was 15 years old. She smiled right at me, her eyes wide with a sick, greedy thrill, relishing the moment, and declared that I was getting absolutely nothing. The entire dining room went dead silent. The jazz music playing through the hidden speakers seemed to fade into the background. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw my plate against the wall. I simply reached for my heavy glass, took a slow, deliberate sip of my vodka on the rocks, looked directly at my father, who was suddenly refusing to meet my eyes, and asked, "Should I tell them now, or do you want to do the honors?" My name is Sutton. I am 33 years old, and I am the sole founder and chief executive officer of Sutton Arrowweave, a high-tech textile engineering company that specializes in antibacterial and temperature-regulating fabrics for extreme sports and medical recovery. And this is the complete, unfiltered story of how my incredibly toxic family planned my absolute financial and emotional humiliation, only to blindly orchestrate their own devastating downfall. I hosted Thanksgiving dinner this year at my sprawling smart compound in Washington state. The property is a massive, intimidating architectural masterpiece of dark brutalist concrete, warm cedar wood, and floor-to-ceiling glass panels sitting right on the edge of a jagged, wind-swept cliff overlooking the freezing, steel-gray waters of Puget Sound. It is the kind of house that demands absolute silence and respect the moment you walk through the massive front doors. My family, however, has always operated under the arrogant assumption that I just rent this place. They genuinely think I share this massive estate with a group of wealthy tech roommates just to afford the monthly lease. They never once bothered to ask for the truth about my living situation, and I never volunteered the information. It fit their twisted narrative perfectly to imagine me, the eternal family scapegoat, constantly struggling to keep my head above water in a world they believed was too big for me. To them, I was still just the stubborn, difficult teenager who dyed fabric in a freezing, poorly lit garage, barely scraping by on sheer luck. They had absolutely no idea that I bought this $4 million property entirely in cash 2 years ago, safely tucked away under a completely anonymous private trust. The long dining table we were gathered around was made of a single, breathtaking slab of reclaimed walnut. It was covered in expensive minimalist ceramics, artisan roasted turkey, handcrafted side dishes, and $400 bottles of imported wine that I had carefully selected and paid for. The ambient lighting from the modern fixtures made the room feel incredibly warm and inviting, providing a stark contrast to the violent, freezing rain lashing against the glass windows outside. But the energy around the table was violently toxic. My younger sister, Fallon, who is 30 years old, sat directly across from me. Fallon is the ultimate golden child. She has always been incredibly entitled, painfully materialistic, and is constantly bailed out by our parents whenever her endless string of terrible, half-baked business ideas inevitably crashes and burns. Beside her sat her husband, Cashin, a 34-year-old man who confidently and loudly calls himself a venture capital consultant. In reality, Cashin is an absolute fraud. He recently bankrupted a massive commercial real estate fund, losing millions of dollars of his clients' money due to pure negligence and arrogance. He has been desperately looking for a cash cow to fund his lavish lifestyle and keep up his ridiculous facade before his former investors drag him into federal court. My parents, Alaric and Genevieve, sat at opposite ends of the long table, acting like the king and queen of an empire they did not build. My mother, Genevieve, a woman who cares more about her country club status than her own children, was already getting teary-eyed with pride just looking at Fallon. My father, Alaric, retired regional bank manager, puffed out his chest with that familiar, manipulative authority he always carried. He looked around my beautiful home with deep, undisguised judgment, clearly thinking he was the smartest and most successful person in the room. Cashin leaned back heavily in my expensive dining chair, practically manspreading, holding his crystal glass of my expensive red wine up to the warm light. He swirled it around carelessly, took a loud, slurping sip, and clicked his tongue in disapproval. He actually had the audacity to look right at me and say the wine lacked structural depth. He said he expected better taste from someone trying so desperately to pretend they lived a luxury lifestyle. Fallon giggled, a high-pitched, grating sound, picking at the organic artisan stuffing I had spent 3 hours preparing, calling it a little too earthy and peasant-like for her refined palate. They sat there in my pristine home, breathing my warm air, eating my expensive food, and openly mocking my entire existence. They were so deeply, hopelessly blinded by their own arrogance. They thought they had me perfectly boxed into the corner of the pathetic, struggling older sister. They were eating my turkey, drinking my wine, and in their sick heads, they were counting down the minutes until they could snatch my entire life away from me. But what they did not know, what they could never comprehend, was that the real countdown clock was already ticking relentlessly on my wrist. Are you ready to hear exactly what happened next? Before I tell you about the massive, life-altering bomb they dropped on that walnut dining table, you need to understand the absolute depth of their betrayal. The profound humiliation I endured at the hands of my toxic family did not start tonight over a dry piece of turkey. It started 18 years ago in a freezing, drafty, completely uninsulated garage. When I was 15 years old, I did not go to high school parties. I did not go to the shopping mall with friends. I did not care about dating or popularity. I spent every single weekend wrapped in a heavy, oversized winter coat, mixing harsh chemical dyes and weaving experimental synthetic fibers on a broken, second-hand loom I bought from a thrift store with my babysitting money. I was completely obsessed with creating a specialized fabric that could naturally regulate human body temperature for extreme sports and medical applications. My hands were permanently stained a deep, bruised shade of blue and black. My fingers were constantly blistered, cracked, and bleeding from the harsh friction of the raw threads. I will never forget the day my Aunt Rosalind came over for a Sunday family dinner. She walked into the freezing garage, wrinkled her nose at the sharp chemical smell of the dyes, looked at my blistered, bleeding hands and the chaotic piles of fabric, and laughed right in my face. It was a cold, dismissive laugh that echoed off the concrete walls. She pointed at me and called me the poor little tailor of the family. My mother, Genevieve, stood right behind her in the doorway and nodded enthusiastically, actually apologizing to my aunt for my weird, embarrassing, low-class hobbies. Fallon, who was 12 at the time and already wearing designer clothes our parents could barely afford, walked over and purposely kicked over a heavy bucket of my most expensive, carefully mixed blue dye just for fun. I watched the vibrant liquid seep into the cold concrete floor, ruining weeks of my hard work. My father, Alaric, just crossed his arms, told me to clean up the pathetic mess, and ordered me to stop wasting my time on useless garbage. But I did not stop. I never stopped. By the time I was 17, my experimental fabric formula finally caught the attention of a massive, national outdoor gear brand. They had seen a small sample I mailed them, and they wanted to place a huge bulk order to test the material in their new line of winter jackets. It was the moment my life was supposed to completely change. It was my golden ticket. But there was a massive legal roadblock. I needed a commercial bank account and a legally binding vendor contract to accept the initial deposit and purchase the massive amount of raw materials required. Because I was a legal minor, I could not sign the corporate paperwork. I went to my father, the regional bank manager, practically begging for his signature to help me launch the limited liability company. Alaric looked at the corporate contract. He saw the massive dollar amount printed on the first page, and his eyes instantly lit up with absolute, unadulterated greed. He told me he would help me, but only under one strict, non-negotiable condition. He demanded to be listed as the sole, 100% legal owner and primary custodian of the limited liability company. He looked down at me and said it was for my own financial protection. He said I was just a naive child playing a dangerous game of business, and I needed a real, educated man to manage the liability and the cash flow. I was backed into a corner. I had absolutely no other choice if I wanted to fulfill the order. I signed the documents and gave him the legal keys to my very first company. The moment the corporate money hit the new bank account, my family treated it like their own personal, endless piggy bank. When Fallon turned 18 and threw a massive temper tantrum demanding a brand new luxury sports car, my parents did not hesitate. They secretly drained my entire college savings fund, the money I had earned from my fabric sales, to buy it for her in cash. When I found out and confronted them, sobbing in the kitchen, my mother slapped me across the face. They told me it was a necessary family sacrifice. They told me I was smart enough to figure out how to pay for community college on my own, while Fallon needed the car to maintain her social status. I stood in the driveway and watched the golden child drive away in a gleaming red convertible paid for entirely by my blistered hands, my bleeding fingers, and my freezing nights in the concrete garage. I learned the hardest, most brutal lesson of my entire life right then and there. In a toxic family, your blood will drain you dry, steal your future, and happily watch you drown just to water their golden child. That deep, burning, unforgettable injustice is the absolute foundation of my empire. It is the reason I marched into the local library the very next day and began relentlessly studying corporate law and asset protection. It is the reason I learned to be completely, terrifyingly ruthless. It is the reason I never shed a single tear for them ever again. What would you do if your own parents stole your entire college fund to buy a luxury sports car for your spoiled sister? We were just finishing the main course, the plates smeared with cranberry sauce and artisan gravy, when Fallon suddenly picked up her heavy silver spoon and began tapping it aggressively against her crystal champagne flute. The sharp, high-pitched clinking sound cut right through the soft jazz music playing in the background and instantly killed whatever shallow conversation was happening. Everyone stopped eating and turned their attention entirely to her. Fallon stood up slowly, deliberately smoothing down the front of her incredibly expensive, emerald green silk maternity dress. She looked around the long dining table, soaking in the absolute center of attention she so desperately craved, like a dying plant absorbing sunlight. Her eyes scanned past our parents, past her arrogant husband, before finally locking onto mine. Her expression was a disgusting, deeply unsettling mix of fake, sisterly pity and pure, unadulterated smug triumph. She took a deep breath and announced to the silent room that she had a massive, life-changing surprise to share with the family. With a sickeningly sweet voice that made my stomach turn, Fallon declared that our father, Alaric, had just finalized some very important, highly confidential legal paperwork earlier that afternoon. She reached down into her expensive leather designer handbag resting on the floor, pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope, and proudly proclaimed that he had legally transferred 100% ownership and total controlling interest of Sutton Arrowweave LLC into her and Cashin's names. She clutched the envelope to her chest and called it an early Christmas gift from Dad. A generous, beautiful way to support her upcoming baby and secure their family's financial future forever. She actually had the absolute nerve to look down at me, tilt her head, and say, "Dad said that little fabric company you played with since you were 15 needs to be managed by real adults now. The market is getting too complicated for you to handle alone. We are taking over the ship, Sutton. You do not have to stress anymore." My mother, Genevieve, gasped in absolute delight, clapping her hands together over her mouth as if she were watching the emotional climax of a beautiful romantic movie. She reached across the table to squeeze Fallon's hand, tears streaming down her perfectly powdered face, telling her how much she deserved this incredible blessing after all her recent hardships. My father, Alaric, just sat there swirling his expensive wine glass, looking incredibly, disgustingly pleased with himself. He puffed his chest out, acting like a generous, wealthy king who had just bestowed a massive, prosperous kingdom upon his favorite, most deserving heir. None of them seemed to care or even acknowledge that the kingdom they were celebrating was built entirely with my blood, my sweat, and my tears. They sat in my beautiful home, drinking my expensive wine, eating the food I cooked, celebrating the brazen, unapologetic theft of my entire life's work right to my face. They truly, deeply thought they had finally won the war. I sat perfectly still and silently looked at Cashin. He was practically vibrating in his chair with unearned confidence and raw greed. He took a long sip of his wine, swirling it around his mouth before setting the crystal glass down with a heavy, authoritative thud. He actually had the audacity to adjust his expensive silk tie, clear his throat loudly, and command the room as if he were giving a keynote speech at a major corporate shareholder meeting. He puffed out his chest, completely ignoring me, and loudly added to the table that they were absolutely thrilled to take the reins of the business. He had the nerve to say that under his brilliant venture capital management and extensive network, they were going to turn my little garage hobby into a real, unstoppable global corporate empire. The absolute, mind-bending delusion in the room was suffocating. The air felt thick and heavy. But I did not yell. I did not throw my porcelain plate at his smug face. I did not flip the heavy walnut table. I simply reached for my heavy crystal glass filled with premium vodka on the rocks. The ice clinked softly, a tiny, sharp sound in the sudden quiet of the room. I took a slow, deliberate sip. I let the cold, sharp liquid burn down my throat, grounding me in the absolute, undeniable reality of the moment. I was perfectly calm. My heart rate did not even spike. Because I knew the explosive, catastrophic secret that was hiding inside that manila envelope they were treating like a winning lottery ticket. I knew exactly what they had just legally chained themselves to. How long do you think they can keep smiling before the reality of their theft destroys them? Cashin could not contain his manic energy. He stood up from the table and began pacing slowly behind Fallon's chair, resting his hands heavily on her shoulders like a proud conqueror surveying his new territory. He looked down at me with the exact kind of condescending, pitying smile you give a small, slightly slow child who thinks they have done something genuinely impressive. "Look, Sutton," Cashin said, his tone dripping with fake corporate professionalism and deep arrogance. "We know this is a massive transition for you. Change is always hard. You have been running the day-to-day operations, playing boss for a long time, and we do appreciate the basic groundwork you laid when you were a teenager. But let us be brutally honest here. You do not have the vision, the education, or the ruthless instinct to scale an enterprise of this size. You are thinking small, local contracts. You are thinking boutique sporting goods stores. I am thinking global distribution, military contracts, and international supply chain dominance. You simply cannot compete at my level." I just stared right at him, my face a completely blank, unreadable mask. A man who recently lost his clients millions of dollars in a catastrophic, highly publicized real estate scheme was standing in my dining room, aggressively lecturing me about global distribution and financial dominance. It was a masterclass in pure psychological projection. But Cashin was not finished stroking his own ego. He smiled wider, showing his perfectly whitened teeth, and said, "However, we do value family loyalty. Fallon and I discussed it at length on the drive over here, and we are willing to keep you on the payroll. We need someone who actually knows the fabric inventory and the chemical formulas. So, if you are willing to learn your place, drop the attitude, and respect the new chain of command, we can offer you a full-time position as the warehouse inventory supervisor. You will get a stable minimum wage salary, decent healthcare benefits, and the best part is, you will not have to worry about the heavy burden of executive decision-making anymore. You can just punch the clock and go home." Fallon chimed in immediately, nodding vigorously and rubbing her pregnant belly dramatically. "It is a very generous offer, Sutton. You really should take it and be grateful. You have always preferred being behind the scenes, getting your hands dirty in the warehouse anyway. Leave the big, complicated business strategies to Cashin. He is the expert." The sheer, unadulterated audacity was breathtaking. It physically hung in the air. They were offering me a humiliating, entry-level demotion in my very own company, a massive tech business currently generating tens of millions of dollars in annual revenue, as if they were throwing a dirty, leftover bone to a starving, desperate dog. Before I could even open my mouth to respond, my mother, Genevieve, leaned forward over her plate. She put on her best, most practiced concerned mother face, the exact same face she always used to gaslight me into submission when I was a child. "Sutton, sweetheart, Please try to understand where we are coming from, Genevieve pleaded, her voice trembling with forced, theatrical emotion. We are family. Family helps family. You have always been the strong one, the independent one who does not need anyone. You just need to be the bigger person right now and step aside gracefully. Fallon is pregnant. She is bringing our precious grandchild into the world, and her stress levels are far too high. And Cashin has had a terrible run of bad luck in the market recently. They are drowning in bills, Sutton. They desperately need the company revenue to survive and keep a roof over their heads. Be a good, supportive sister for once in your life and accept the blessing your father has given them. I looked at the four of them sitting around my gorgeous dining table. The fake tears, the massive guilt trips, the constant, suffocating expectation that I must completely shrink my entire life and hand over my hard-earned success so Fallon could comfortably expand hers. It was the exact same toxic, parasitic dynamic they had forced on me since I was a teenager bleeding in that garage. But this time, I was not a helpless 15-year-old girl desperate for their love and approval. I was a grown, powerful woman holding all the cards, and I was about to play the winning hand. I set my linen napkin down gently on the table, keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of emotion. A warehouse supervisor. How incredibly thoughtful of you, Cashin. I accepted the offer of surrender. But the surrender they were about to witness was not mine. Have you ever completely agreed with an enemy just to watch them eagerly walk straight into a lethal trap? My immediate, calm compliance completely stunned the entire room. My father, Alaric, blinked rapidly in total confusion, his jaw dropping slightly. He had mentally prepared for a massive, hysterical screaming match, a brutal legal battle threatening lawsuits, and a desperate, crying plea for mercy. He had absolutely not prepared for me to simply nod my head and hand over the keys to the kingdom without shedding a single tear or raising my voice. Cashin, however, was entirely too blinded by his own massive ego and desperate greed to see the blazing red flags waving right in front of his face. He grinned widely, looking incredibly proud of his supposed ruthless negotiation skills, truly believing he had intimidated me into total submission. I reached down into my heavy leather tote bag resting beside my chair and pulled out my sleek, silver tablet. I woke the screen with a tap, navigated past the security firewalls into my administrative dashboard, and pulled up the master digital handover protocols. I placed the tablet flat on the reclaimed walnut table and slid it smoothly across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of Cashin's empty dinner plate. You are absolutely right, Cashin, I said, my tone incredibly bright, professional, and entirely accommodating. Why fight it? You clearly have a brilliant, unmatched vision for the brand's future. Dad, since you are the legal custodian who stood over me and signed the papers when I was a minor, it is only fair that you execute your legal rights to transfer the asset. I pulled a digital stylus from the magnetic edge of the protective case and held it out directly to Cashin. Here is the master access portal, I instructed, pointing to the glowing digital document on the screen. If you sign your full legal name right there on the digital line, it immediately transfers the primary banking authorizations, the vendor communication portals, the state tax board contacts, and all the corporate liability acknowledgments directly to your personal email address. I will sign my formal executive resignation right below it. You do not have to wait until Monday. You can have it all right now tonight. Cashin practically snatched the digital stylus from my hand, his eyes wide with manic excitement. Smart girl, he muttered quickly, eagerly scribbling his digital signature across the screen without stopping to read a single line of the dense legal text. Glad to see you finally understand your proper place in the hierarchy of this family. He hit the bright green confirm button at the bottom of the screen. A sharp, loud beep echoed in the quiet dining room. I smiled even wider, a cold, predatory smile that none of them noticed. The steel trap was officially locked shut. The exact moment the confirmation screen flashed green, Cashin tossed the stylus back onto the table as if he had just closed a massive, billion-dollar corporate acquisition on Wall Street. He immediately pulled his expensive smartphone from his tailored suit pocket, his thumbs flying rapidly across the screen as he prepared to take absolute, unchecked control of my life's work. Right, Cashin snapped, waving his hand dismissively in my direction to get my attention. I need the master administrative passwords immediately. I want full, unrestricted access to the primary banking portals, the employee payroll system, and the complete directory of our international raw material vendor contacts. I need to see the exact profit margins we are working with before the international markets open on Monday morning. Send it all to my phone now. I nodded smoothly, pulling the tablet back toward me. I opened the security settings and began typing his personal email address into the primary ownership field. I was systematically transferring the digital keys to a man who had absolutely no idea what he was unlocking. Cashin was a man who loudly called himself a financial genius, yet he did not ask to see a single profit and loss statement before signing. He did not ask to review the corporate debt profile, the open accounts payable, or the pending legal liabilities. He just blindly, greedily signed the absolute assumption of liability because he was completely blinded by the illusion of instant wealth. He thought he was inheriting a gold mine that would solve all his massive failures. He had absolutely no idea he had just willingly chained himself and his pregnant wife to a rapidly sinking ship laden with explosives. Do you think he will realize his catastrophic mistake before the water reaches his neck? Cashin looked down at his smartphone as a massive barrage of new automated system emails flooded his inbox. He scrolled through them rapidly, a look of pure, unadulterated satisfaction washing over his smug face as he saw the banking portal confirmations and state tax registry updates roll in. He actually laughed out loud, a harsh, arrogant sound that echoed off my high concrete walls. My father, Alaric, beamed with overwhelming pride, his chest puffed out so far the buttons on his shirt strained. He raised his wine glass high in the air. Now that is exactly how you execute a ruthless, clean business deal, Alaric announced proudly, his booming voice filling the room. A toast to Fallon and Cashin, the real, educated business minds of this family. I always knew you two would build an empire. I interlaced my fingers resting on the table and leaned forward slightly. Since Cashin was so incredibly eager to play the role of the high-powered, untouchable corporate executive, I decided it was the perfect time to ask a few basic, entry-level operational questions, just to see exactly how deep his delusion really went. I looked directly at him, keeping my expression perfectly pleasant and entirely innocent. So, Cashin, I asked, my voice effortlessly cutting through their loud, arrogant celebratory chatter. How exactly do you plan to handle the new hospital logistics next week? Cashin stopped chewing his food. He glanced at me, a brief flash of genuine confusion crossing his features before his arrogant, untouchable mask slid right back into place. He swallowed loudly and wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. What hospital logistics? He asked dismissively, waving his hand in the air. I clarified, speaking incredibly slowly, enunciating every single word as if addressing a slow toddler. The medical supply contracts are massive this year. Our main Pennsylvania facility needs to ship out our specialized antibacterial recovery fabric for the general hospital network by next Friday. The contract is worth $2 million. The raw materials require highly specific, temperature-controlled freight during transit. If we miss the delivery window by even 24 hours, the hospital administration imposes a strict 20% penalty on the entire invoice. Have you coordinated with the specialized freight forwarders yet to ensure compliance? Cashin let out a loud, mocking laugh, leaning back in his chair. Please, Sutton, he scoffed, rolling his eyes. Do not try to overwhelm me with your little administrative warehouse details to make yourself sound important. I have high-level finance and logistics connections all over the East Coast. I will just make a quick phone call on Monday morning and have one of my junior supply chain guys handle your little box shipping issue. It is a simple logistical pivot. I will not be bogged down by the minor details. Fallon nodded along enthusiastically, completely mesmerized by his meaningless, empty corporate buzzwords. Exactly, she added, taking a delicate sip of her sparkling water. You always make things so unnecessarily complicated and stressful, Sutton. Cashin knows how to delegate. That is what real, powerful leaders do. They do not worry about boxes. I did not bother correcting him. I did not tell him that delegating a temperature-controlled medical shipment to an unqualified junior broker would result in immediate contract termination and a massive lawsuit. I just let his sheer ignorance hang in the air, a massive, invisible monument to his impending doom. Instead, I shifted my intense gaze down the long table to my father. Alaric was happily buttering a piece of artisan bread, looking completely relaxed and victorious now that he had successfully dumped the company. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice low, sharp, and deadly serious. "Are you absolutely certain Cashin is ready for the liabilities of this company?" I emphasized the word liabilities just enough to see a brief, panicked twitch in my father's right eye. For a split second, the smug, victorious aura vanished from his face, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of a man who knew exactly what massive secret he was hiding in the dark. He slammed his butter knife down hard against his porcelain plate, the sharp clack echoing loudly. He pointed a trembling, angry finger directly at my face. "Listen to me, young lady," Alaric snarled, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "You need to shut up and stop being a bitter, jealous loser. Cashin is a financial expert. There is no liability he cannot handle. Stop trying to ruin your sister's night just because you failed." I held my hands up in a gesture of total surrender. "You are right, Dad," I said smoothly, a cold smile playing on my lips. "I apologize. I will not mention the liabilities again." I took another slow sip of my drink, my eyes leaving his red face and locking onto the sleek digital clock resting on the modern fireplace mantel across the room. It was exactly 6:58 in the evening. Today was Thursday, the 25th of November. In the highly regulated corporate banking world, the 25th of every single month is the designated, non-negotiable date for automated institutional debt collection. Exactly at 7 o'clock, the automated clearing house system initiates an irreversible, automatic sweep of required funds from the primary operating account. I watched the clock tick. 6:59. 10 seconds left. 5 seconds. I stared directly at Cashin's expensive smartphone resting face up on the table. 3, 2, 1. The clock struck 7. And the digital guillotine finally dropped. Thank you so much for watching the story so far. If you are enjoying this absolute takedown of a toxic family, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below telling me which city you are watching from. Every single comment helps this video reach more people who might need to hear this message. Thank you for your support. Now let us get back to the absolute destruction of Cashin's ego. Cashin's expensive smartphone vibrated violently against the polished reclaimed walnut wood of the dining table. The sudden, harsh buzzing sound cut sharply through the smooth jazz music and the loud, boastful laughter of my family. Because I had just legally transferred all the master administrative privileges over to him less than 10 minutes ago, his personal email address was now directly linked to the primary banking portal of the limited liability company. Every single financial alert, every transaction receipt, and every automated banking trigger was now routed straight to the device sitting right next to his half-eaten plate of turkey. Cashin paused in the middle of his grand, sweeping story about leveraging real estate and international supply chains. He glanced down at the glowing screen, clearly annoyed by the interruption. He probably expected it to be a welcome email from the state tax board or a generic confirmation message from the corporate domain registry welcoming him as the new chief executive officer. He picked up the phone with a lazy, arrogant flick of his wrist, his other hand still holding his crystal wine glass. He tapped the notification banner to open the full message, bringing the bright screen closer to his face. I watched him with absolute, unwavering focus. I did not blink. I did not move a muscle. It is a very rare and fascinating thing to witness the exact second a man's entire fabricated reality collapses in on itself. First, his perfectly groomed eyebrows furrowed in deep, genuine confusion. Then, the arrogant, self-satisfied smirk that had been plastered across his face all evening completely vanished. His jaw literally went slack. The hand holding his expensive wine began to tremble ever so slightly, causing the dark red liquid to ripple and splash against the sides of the crystal glass. He blinked hard, aggressively swiping down on his screen to refresh the email application, desperately hoping the numbers staring back at him were just a bizarre digital glitch or a spam message. He tapped into the attached secure banking portal link, his thumb moving frantically now. The confident, booming venture capital expert from 2 minutes ago was completely gone, replaced by a terrified man staring directly into the abyss of absolute financial ruin. Fallon noticed his sudden, heavy silence. She stopped talking to my mother about her ridiculously expensive nursery designer and frowned at him. "Cashin, honey, what is it?" she asked, her voice tinged with severe irritation. "Put the phone away. We are celebrating our new business. You can look at boring emails tomorrow." Cashin did not answer her. He did not even look at her. His eyes were glued to the bright screen of his phone, completely mesmerized by the disaster unfolding in his inbox. He set his wine glass down on the table so hard that the crystal chimed loudly, nearly spilling the dark red liquid onto the pristine white linen tablecloth. "What the hell is this?" Cashin muttered, his voice barely above a hoarse whisper. My father, Alaric, froze. The piece of artisan bread he was about to eat stopped halfway to his mouth. Alaric knew exactly what that notification was. He had been dreading it for months. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale, sickly, and suddenly very old. "Speak up, Cashin," my father demanded, trying to inject a false sense of authority into his suddenly shaking voice. "What are you looking at? If it is just a vendor invoice, just ignore it until Monday morning." Cashin finally looked up from his phone, his eyes darting frantically between my father and me. His chest heaved as he struggled to process the information displaying on his banking dashboard. He leaned forward, bracing his hands heavily on the edge of the dining table. "Why is there an auto draft of $180,000 pending from the operating account?" Cashin asked, his voice cracking with rising, undeniable panic. The dining room went completely, suffocatingly silent. Even my mother stopped chewing, her fork suspended in midair as the sheer size of the number registered in her mind. $180,000 was not a minor administrative fee. It was not a late shipping penalty. It was a massive, staggering sum of money, and it was currently being automatically extracted from a bank account that Cashin now legally owned. Cashin looked directly at me, his eyes wide and pleading for a logical explanation. "Sutton, what is this? Did you schedule a massive vendor payout right before you handed over the credentials? Did you try to steal from the company accounts on your way out? Cancel it. Cancel the transaction right now before it clears." I calmly reached for my linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it next to my plate. I looked at Cashin, then shifted my cold gaze to my father, who was suddenly sweating profusely under the warm light of the modern chandelier. "I did not schedule anything, Cashin," I replied, my voice perfectly steady and crystal clear. "I have absolutely no control over that account anymore. You changed the master passwords yourself just 10 minutes ago. That transaction is an automated institutional sweep. It happens on the 25th of every single month, precisely at 7 o'clock in the evening." Cashin shook his head violently, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "What do you mean an institutional sweep? What institution? For what?" I looked at him, feeling absolutely no pity whatsoever. "I think you should read the description attached to the pending transaction," I suggested simply. Cashin practically shoved his face back into his phone. He read the tiny text beneath the massive deduction amount, his voice trembling as he spoke the words aloud to the silent room. "Small Business Administration commercial loan repayment, principal, and interest." The words hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Cashin stared at his screen, desperately trying to reject the information his eyes were transmitting. The notification banner glowed brightly, an unyielding digital witness to the catastrophic mistake he had just made. I reached for my crystal glass filled with vodka on the rocks. The ice clinked softly against the sides as I lifted it. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The cold liquid burned pleasantly down my throat. I lowered the glass, my eyes shifting from Cashin's horrified face to my father sitting frozen at the head of the table. Alaric was gripping the edges of the mahogany table so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He looked like a man standing on the gallows, watching the executioner place the hood over his head. The proud, booming patriarch who had just toasted to his own brilliance was completely gone. I looked right at him, feeling a deep, satisfying sense of closure wash over me. Should I tell them now? I asked, my voice carrying clearly across the silent dining room. Or do you want to do the honors, Dad? My father opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. He swallowed hard, his throat working frantically, but his signature banking authority had completely evaporated. He could not look at Fallon. He could not look at Cashin. Cashin slammed his hand flat against the table, making the fine ceramics jump. What loan? He demanded, his voice cracking under the intense pressure. Sutton, look at me right now. What the hell is this loan? I turned my attention back to my new chief executive officer. I folded my hands neatly in my lap. It is exactly what it says it is, Cashin, I explained calmly, maintaining the professional tone of a corporate advisor delivering very bad news. Sutton Arrowweave LLC is currently carrying a massive commercial debt. Specifically, a $7.5 million business loan secured through a commercial lender. Did you really think you were inheriting a gold mine without checking the debt profile first? Fallon gasped loudly, pressing both of her manicured hands against her chest as if she had just been physically shot. $7.5 million, she repeated, the number clearly too massive for her entitled, sheltered mind to properly comprehend. She looked at Cashin, waiting for him to laugh it off, waiting for him to tell her it was just a silly accounting misunderstanding. But Cashin was not laughing. Cashin shook his head violently, his eyes wild with aggressive, terrifying denial. No, he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the tablet I had pushed across the table earlier. That is completely impossible. I did not see any debt schedules on the ownership transfer documents. I did not sign any commercial loan agreements tonight. You're lying. You did not have to sign new loan agreements, I pointed out, leaning forward slightly to make sure he heard every single word clearly. You signed a blanket assumption of liability when you formally took over the limited liability company. You did not ask to see the balance sheets. You did not ask for a list of active creditors or review the corporate credit profile. You just saw the word ownership and blindly rushed to sign your name before I could change my mind. When you accept an LLC, Cashin, you accept its assets and its debts. All of them. Cashin looked like he was going to be physically sick right there on my dining table. As a man who claimed to work in high-level venture capital, he knew exactly what an assumption of liability meant. He knew the inescapable, ironclad legal trap he had just sprinted into with a giant smile on his face. And that notification you just received, I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. That is the automated draft for the monthly principal and interest payment. $180,000 every single month, automatically withdrawn on the 25th right around dinner time. That is the burn rate you just happily inherited. My mother, Genevieve, finally found her voice, though it was barely a high-pitched, desperate squeak. But Sutton, the company revenue covers that, right? You are a highly successful brand. You just pay the massive loan with the profits from the fabric sales. It is fine. I smiled at my mother, a cold, sharp smile. Cashin did not share my mother's naive optimism. He stared at his phone, his breathing jagged and uneven. He understood the brutal, unforgiving math. $180,000 a month was an aggressive, suffocating repayment schedule. It was the kind of financial drain that could instantly sink a company if cash flow was disrupted for even a few days. You set me up, Cashin whispered, his voice shaking with a terrifying mixture of pure rage and sheer panic. You set me up to take the fall for this massive debt. I did not set you up to do anything, I replied smoothly. I simply sat here and watched you demand the keys to a burning building. You wanted the company. You insulted my intelligence. You offered me a minimum wage job in my own warehouse, and you laughed at me. I just gave you exactly what you aggressively demanded. Fallon grabbed Cashin's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. Cashin, she pleaded, her voice rising in absolute hysteria. What does this mean? We cannot afford to pay a bank almost $200,000 a month. Cancel the transfer. Give the company back to her right now. Cashin looked at his wife with a hollow, devastated expression. We cannot just give it back, Fallon, Cashin said, his voice completely defeated. The liability is already securely in our names. The state has it. The bank has it. Fallon physically recoiled from her husband, her hands dropping from his arm as if he had suddenly caught a contagious, lethal disease. She looked at our father, her eyes wide with desperate confusion. Dad, Fallon pleaded, her voice cracking into a sob. Tell me this is a sick joke. Tell me you did not just trick us into taking on a $7.5 million debt. Alaric opened his mouth, but he looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. He could not form a single coherent sentence. He just kept wiping the heavy sweat from his forehead with his expensive linen napkin, his eyes darting frantically toward the front door. Since my father seems to have temporarily lost his booming executive voice, I will go ahead and fill in the blanks for everyone, I said. I reached back into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, heavy black binder I had prepared earlier this week. I dropped it onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. I flipped it open, revealing a stack of high-quality printouts featuring the unmistakable letterhead of a major national commercial lender. What you are looking at is the master loan origination file, I explained, tapping the top page. Exactly 3 years ago, my father realized that his name was still legally listed as the primary owner of Sutton Arrowweave LLC from when I was a minor. He also realized that the company was generating massive gross revenue. So, he went to a commercial bank, presented himself as the sole proprietor, and applied for a massive commercial expansion loan. Cashin leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the documents upside down. He approved $7.5 million? Cashin whispered, absolutely horrified. How did you not know he pulled millions out of your own operating account? Because he did not put it in the operating account, Cashin, I corrected him sharply. He set up a shadow account under the LLC umbrella, a completely separate ledger that I had absolutely no visibility into. The bank evaluated the company based on the tax returns, approved the funds, and wired the entire $7.5 million directly into his secret account. My mother clutched her chest, her face completely pale. Alaric? Genevieve gasped, her voice trembling with genuine horror. What did you do with $7.5 million? We do not have that kind of money in our savings. I flipped to the second page in the binder, which consisted of detailed bank statements and wire transfer logs. Let us review the corporate expenditures of the former chief executive, I announced clearly. Within the first month, he wired $3 million to various offshore casinos. He systematically drained millions to cover massive, high-stakes gambling debts. Alaric finally found his voice. It was an investment. He croaked, his hands shaking violently. I had a system. I was going to double the money and put it all back. You bet $3 million on blackjack and roulette, I fired back, my voice dripping with absolute disgust. You are not an investor, Dad. You are a degenerate gambler who stole from his own daughter. Cashin grabbed the folder, flipping through the pages frantically. Wait a minute, Cashin growled, pointing a shaking finger at a massive wire transfer. What is this withdrawal for $2 million? This went in my commercial real estate fund. I smiled. Yes, Cashin. My father used my company's debt to secretly bail out your failing fund so Fallon would not lose her lavish lifestyle. But wait, there is more. I pointed to the final highlighted line item. And this wire for $1.5 million? That went to a real estate escrow account. That money purchased a luxury, glass-front vacation home in Aspen. And the deed is solely in Fallon's name. Cashin slowly turned his head to look at his pregnant wife. The veins in his neck were bulging. You knew, Cashin hissed, his voice lethal. I swear I did not know where the money came from. Fallon cried hysterically. Dad told me it was an early inheritance. Well, it is not an inheritance anymore, Fallon, I reminded her cheerfully. It is a debt. And as of tonight, you and Cashin owe the bank for your own ski house and your father's gambling addiction. How does it feel to finally pay your own bills? The absolute gravity of the situation hung heavily in the dead air of the dining room. The grand illusion of their immense, untouchable wealth, built entirely on embezzlement, fraud, and my stolen labor, had just evaporated into thin air. Cashin was gripping the edges of the table, his knuckles white, his breathing ragged. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of financial supremacy, and his massive ego absolutely refused to let him be the victim of a bad deal. Suddenly, Cashin stopped pacing. The sheer panic that had gripped him just moments ago seemed to evaporate, replaced by a sudden, manic surge of adrenaline. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "You know what?" Cashin said, his voice rising, regaining that arrogant edge that had irritated me all evening. He pointed a finger directly at me. "You are just trying to scare us, because you are out of the game." $7.5 million sounds like a lot to a small-minded girl who used to dye fabric in a garage. But in the real corporate world, leveraged debt is absolutely nothing. Fallon looked up at him, her mascara streaking down her pale cheeks. "What are you talking about, Cashin?" she cried. "It is $7.5 million. We do not have it. We do not need to have it in cash, Fallon." Cashin snapped, clearly annoyed that his own wife could not keep up with his supposed financial genius. He turned to face the entire room, spreading his arms wide as if delivering a keynote speech at an investor conference. "Do the math. Sutton just admitted her company generates massive revenue. Industry experts value the Sutton Arrowweave brand at roughly $65 million based on its current market share and exclusive medical contracts." He began pacing again, but this time with the confident swagger of a Wall Street shark closing a hostile takeover. "So, we inherited a liability. Big deal. We also inherited a $65 million asset. You take the $65 million, subtract the $7.5 million debt, and that still leaves us with a net equity of over $57 million. My mother let out a small, breathless gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as the massive number registered. $57 million, Genevieve whispered, her eyes darting between my father and Cashin. "Alaric, is that true?" My father quickly nodded, grabbing onto Cashin's logic like a drowning man clutching a life raft. "Exactly," my father agreed, his booming voice returning. "The brand is a total goldmine. The debt is just a minor operational cost. I told you Cashin knew what he was doing." Cashin let out a loud, mocking laugh, looking down at me with absolute triumph. "Did you really think you could outsmart me, Sutton?" he sneered. "You just gave me a multi-million-dollar payday. I am not even going to bother running your warehouse. I am just going to flip the entire enterprise. I will sell Sutton Arrowweave to a private equity firm, pay off your father's little debt and Fallon, and I will walk away with $57 million in pure profit by Christmas." He pulled his phone back out of his pocket. "You do not believe me? Watch this," Cashin commanded the room. "I have a major contact at a top-tier private equity firm in Manhattan. They acquire high-growth tech brands all the time. I am going to call him right now, put him on speakerphone, and we will start the acquisition process tonight." Nobody moved. My parents watched him with breathless anticipation. Fallon sat up a little straighter in her chair, the dollar signs clearly flashing back into her greedy eyes. Cashin tapped the screen and placed the phone flat in the center of the mahogany dining table. He hit the speaker button. The dial tone echoed loudly in the silent room. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. Finally, a deep, professional voice answered the line. "This is David. David, my man," Cashin shouted enthusiastically, leaning over the table. "It is Cashin. Listen, I have an incredible opportunity for your firm, and I wanted to give you the first look. I just acquired full ownership and controlling interest of Sutton Arrowweave LLC. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Sutton Arrowweave?" the broker asked, his tone suddenly shifting to sharp professional interest. "The brand with the exclusive General Hospital and military defense contracts?" "That is the one," Cashin boasted, shooting a triumphant glare in my direction. "I am looking to initiate a fast cash buyout. The brand is easily valued at $65 million. I am willing to fast-track an acquisition for your firm if we can start the paperwork on Monday." I sat back in my chair, picked up my vodka, and took another slow sip. Cashin had perfectly set the stage. He had built his fantasy castle high in the sky, completely unaware that he had built it on quicksand. The broker's voice echoed through the speakerphone, sharp and incredibly amused. Cashin, I just ran the corporate registry search you requested. I am not sure who gave you this tip, but you are looking at a ghost. Cashin leaned closer to the phone, his smug smile faltering instantly. Check again. Sutton Arrowweave LLC. I have the ownership transfer right here. A harsh chuckle crackled over the line. I do not need to check again. Sutton Arrowweave LLC is an active entity, yes, but it is purely an operating shell. It holds 0 assets, 0 intellectual property, 0 real estate, and 0 proprietary formulas. Its current valuation is essentially the cost of the state filing fee. You are trying to leverage a hollow cardboard box, buddy. Call me back when you have something real to sell. I reached across the turkey platter and tapped the red button on Cashin's phone, ending the call abruptly. The silence in the dining room was absolute, heavy with the scent of roasted sage and sudden, crushing defeat. Cashin stared at the blank screen of his phone, his mouth opening and closing. I did not give him time to recover. I reached into my tote bag, pulled out a massive, leather-bound legal binder stamped with the red seal of the state of Delaware, and slammed it down right in the center of the Thanksgiving table. The crystal wine glasses rattled violently. You really thought I would make it that easy? I asked, my voice deadly calm. You thought I would build a $65 million empire and leave it sitting in a single, unprotected LLC where any greedy family member could snatch it? When I was 18, while you were all driving sports cars paid for by my sweat, I spent every free hour in the campus law library. I learned about asset protection. I learned about corporate veils. And before I ever signed another major contract, I filed the paperwork to form a Delaware C-Corp. I named it Sutton Holdings. Cashin buried his face in his hands. A low, pathetic groan escaped his throat. He worked in finance. He knew exactly what a Delaware C-Corp meant. Sutton Holdings is the true powerhouse, I explained, looking directly at my father. It is the absolute fortress. Every single chemical formula, the proprietary weaving patents, the trademarks, the logo, and those massive exclusive hospital contracts, they all reside safely locked inside Sutton Holdings. Sutton Arrowweave LLC is simply a third-party vendor. It is a middleman that leases warehouse space and handles shipping. It owns nothing. If your private equity friends try to seize the LLC, all they will get is a stack of empty cardboard boxes and a leased warehouse space. They get 0 intellectual property. They get 0 revenue streams. You handed them a piece of paper that legally entitles them to absolutely nothing. Did you really think I would let you steal my life twice? My father slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably, her perfect Thanksgiving dinner completely destroyed. And Cashin just sat there, staring blankly at the massive Delaware corporate binder, his entire world crumbling into fine dust. Fallon, who had been sitting rigidly beside Cashin this entire time, finally snapped out of her shock. But the LLC still has value. Fallon stammered, desperation bleeding into her shrill voice. It has the vendor contract to distribute the fabric. That contract has to be worth millions. You can just sell the rights to that contract to another logistics company. That was the exact moment I had been waiting for. The final, fatal blow to their arrogant, parasitic existence. I reached into the front pocket of my tote bag and pulled out a crisp, single sheet of heavy bond paper. It was folded neatly in thirds. I walked around the table and stopped right beside Cashin's chair. I dropped the paper onto his empty dinner plate. Pick it up, I commanded. His trembling fingers fumbled with the paper as he unfolded it. His eyes darted across the black text, his face draining of whatever color it had left. What is it? My mother demanded, her voice hysterical. Sutton, what did you just give him? Read it out loud, Cashin, I said, ignoring her completely. Read it to the family. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was physically incapable of speaking the words that cemented his absolute doom. Fine, I will do it, I said, taking the paper back from his limp hands. I cleared my throat, adopting a cold, professional tone. To whom it may concern. This letter serves as formal legal notice that Sutton Holdings Incorporated is exercising its right to invoke the termination clause outlined in Section 4, Paragraph B, of the Master Vendor Agreement with Sutton Arrowweave LLC. I paused, letting the legal jargon hang heavy in the air. As per the terms of our contract, I continued, any unapproved change in ownership, controlling interest, or the pledging of the LLC as collateral to an outside entity constitutes a material breach of trust. Therefore, as of 5:00 p.m. today, my C-Corp has officially terminated its vendor contract with your LLC due to change of ownership. Your LLC is dead, Cashin, I stated, dropping the paper back onto his plate. It has no contracts. It has no inventory. It has no assets. It is an empty shell with a $7.5 million loan attached to it. Fallon snatched the termination notice from his hands. Her perfectly lined eyes scanned the document rapidly. Cashin, she whispered, her voice trembling with a sudden, rising panic. You told me we were securing a bridge loan against a $65 million asset. You told me we were buying out your sister's distribution network to save your firm. What does she mean? Cashin could not look at her. Answer me. Fallon shrieked, slamming her hand flat on the table, making the remaining silverware jump. Did you or did you not sign a personal guarantee for a commercial loan last month using this LLC as collateral? Cashin finally nodded, a slow, agonizing movement of his head. He had secretly pledged the LLC to cover the losses in his real estate fund, assuming he owned the valuable patents. My father's head snapped up. His eyes, previously glazed over with shock, locked onto Cashin. Cashin, my father whispered, his voice trembling. If you pledged assets you did not actually own to a private equity firm to secure a multi-million-dollar loan, that is not just a bad business deal. That is wire fraud. That is a major federal crime. I nodded slowly, locking eyes with my brother-in-law. Exactly. Cashin forged documents claiming he had controlling interest in the patents to secure millions. He committed felony fraud to hide his embezzlement. My mother, Genevieve, gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in pure horror. Sutton, you have to fix this. She cried, stumbling around the table to grab my arm. You have to transfer the patents to the LLC right now. If you do not, Cashin will go to federal prison. They will arrest him. Fallon will be a single mother. I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my arm, feeling a profound sense of liberation. Fix his felony fraud, Mom? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low and completely even. He forged federal documents. He stole my corporate identity. He tried to sell my entire life's work to cover up the fact that he embezzled money from his own clients. That is a string of severe federal crimes. And you are standing here demanding I become an accomplice to wire fraud just to protect your Golden family? I am asking you to have a heart. Genevieve shrieked, her face twisting into an ugly mask of desperation. We are your parents. We gave you life. Let us talk about having a heart, Mom. I shot back, my voice cutting through the air like a whip. Where was your heart when I was freezing in the garage? Where was your heart when you drained my college savings to buy a sports car? You built this monster. I pointed directly at Cashin. You and Dad shielded Fallon and Cashin from every single consequence of their actions. You taught them that the rules do not apply to them. And now, the real world has finally caught up. I picked up my heavy Delaware corporate binder and slid it carefully back into my leather tote bag. I am not your financial shield anymore, I said, looking at them one last time. I will not sign over a single patent. I will not reinstate that vendor contract. I will not pay a single dime of his criminal defense fees. When the FBI knocks on your door next week, do not bother calling me. What would you do if your family demanded you commit a crime to save them? Before I could even zip my tote bag shut, Fallon burst into a fit of absolute, unhinged rage. Her face was streaked with ruined mascara, and her chest was heaving with manic energy. She completely ignored the fact that her husband was facing federal prison. Her only concern was her own immediate comfort and luxury. You think you can just walk away from us? Fallon screamed, her voice shrill enough to make the modern light fixtures vibrate. "We are losing our home because of your selfish games. The bank is going to foreclose on the Aspen house and our primary residence by the end of the month. If the bank throws us out onto the street, we are moving into your rental house." I stopped mid-motion. I looked at Fallon, then at Cashin, and finally at my parents, who were watching this exchange with a mix of horror and sudden, desperate hope. They actually believed Fallon's demand was a viable solution. They still viewed me as the subservient, pathetic daughter who could be bullied into providing shelter and resources on demand. They truly believed they could just crash in my spare bedrooms while they sorted out their federal indictments. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was the first time I had smiled warmly all evening. "My rental house?" I asked, the sheer amusement clear in my voice. "Fallon, do you honestly believe I rent this estate?" "Of course you do." My mother snapped, her tear-stained face twisting into a scowl. "You told us you were leasing a small place. You only rented this massive smart compound for the long holiday weekend so you could pretend to be successful and show off to us." I reached back into my leather tote bag. The Delaware binder was safely tucked away, but there was one more document resting at the very bottom. A document I had brought specifically for this exact, inevitable moment. I pulled out a thick, heavy stock folder embossed with the gold seal of the county clerk's office. "I lied, Mom," I said simply. "I lied because I knew if I told you the truth, you and Dad would immediately demand to move in, or expect me to host your extravagant country club parties, or try to use my property as collateral for Cashin's endless financial black holes." I opened the folder and extracted a certified property deed, holding it up so the gold seal caught the warm light of the chandelier. "I do not rent an apartment," I stated, locking eyes with Fallon, whose arrogant expression was rapidly dissolving into utter confusion. "And I did not rent this house for the weekend. I bought this entire $4 million estate 2 years ago. I paid for it entirely in cash. It is legally owned by the anonymous private trust one set up. That is why Cashin could not find any real estate assets when he tried to sell me out." The silence that fell over the room this time was entirely different. It was the silence of absolute, crushing defeat. My parents looked around the massive, elegantly appointed dining room as if seeing it for the very first time. They looked at the custom concrete walls, the imported minimalist fireplace, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the freezing ocean. The reality that I owned all of it, free and clear, while their golden child was facing federal prison and total bankruptcy, finally shattered their delusions. "You cannot move into my house, Fallon," I continued, my tone dropping to a cold, authoritative command. "Because I live right here, and I absolutely do not allow criminals, frauds, or parasites in my home." Alaric stood up, his face flushed with extreme indignity. "You are throwing your own family out onto the street in the freezing rain on Thanksgiving? Have you lost your mind? We are your parents. You lost the right to call yourselves my parents the moment you cheered for my destruction," I fired back, stepping toward the head of the table. "I am giving all of you exactly 10 minutes to gather your coats and walk out my front doors. If anyone is still standing inside my house or on my driveway at the end of those 10 minutes, I will call the local police precinct and have you all arrested for criminal trespassing." "Sutton, please," my mother wailed, reaching out toward me again. "10 minutes, Mom," I interrupted sharply, raising my phone. "The clock starts right now." Alaric took a step forward, his fists clenched, using his physical size to try and intimidate me. "I will sue you," he roared, saliva flying from his lips. "I will sue you for emotional distress. I will destroy you." I did not flinch. I quietly reached under the edge of the dining table and pressed the silent panic button installed there. I tapped my phone screen, bringing up my active security application. "You are completely out of your depth, Alaric," I whispered. "I am not playing a game." Before he could take another aggressive step, the sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel driveway pierced the tense silence. Red and blue lights began flashing furiously through the frosted glass panels of the massive front doors, casting erratic, frantic shadows across the concrete floor of the foyer. Too loud, authoritative knocks hammered against the door frame. My private security team, led by Declan alongside two uniformed police officers, stepped into the entryway. The eviction had officially begun. Have you ever had to call the police on your own toxic family to protect your peace? The absolute humiliation that washed over my family was palpable and deeply satisfying. The Golden family, the people who cared more about their social standing and country club appearances than anything else in the entire world, were being publicly evicted from a $4 million estate by armed police officers and private security guards. Fallon began sobbing uncontrollably, grabbing her expensive designer coat with violently shaking hands. Genevieve could not even walk straight. My father had to physically support her as they fumbled in the hall closet for their jackets. Cashin moved like a hollow zombie, staring blankly ahead as Declan, my head of security, directed him firmly toward the front door. Alaric did not say another word. He shot me one last look of pure, unadulterated venom and marched out the door, escorted closely by a police officer. I stood quietly in my beautiful, peaceful foyer, watching them all file out into the freezing, relentless November rain. The flashing police lights illuminated their pale, terrified faces, capturing the exact moment their arrogant, abusive empire finally crumbled into wet dust. They had tried to steal everything I built, and instead, they had lost absolutely everything they had. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing the freezing draft outside, leaving me in total, luxurious silence. 3 weeks later, that profound silence remained my absolute favorite luxury. The frantic flashing lights of that Thanksgiving night felt like a distant, chaotic nightmare, entirely disconnected from the beautiful reality I was now building. By the time the final week of December arrived, my estate had been completely transformed. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere that had poisoned the dining room was entirely gone, replaced by the scent of fresh pine, roasted chestnuts, and genuine, uninhibited laughter. I was hosting my first annual Christmas Eve gala. The marble floors echoed with the cheerful chatter of my chosen family. Over by the roaring fireplace, my lead chemical engineer, Brea, was animatedly explaining a new fabric extraction method to Theron, my brilliant corporate lawyer. Theron was the man who had helped me build the impenetrable legal fortress around Sutton Holdings. These were the people who had stayed late in the cramped, poorly ventilated laboratories during the early days. These were the friends who celebrated my victories without a single ounce of jealousy and supported me through the setbacks without a whisper of judgment. We had built an empire together, brick by brick, built on a foundation of mutual respect and absolute trust. While my empire expanded, the illusion my biological family had so desperately clung to spectacularly imploded. The fallout was swift, highly public, and absolutely brutal. Vanguard Equity officially called in the massive loan. Since the LLC was entirely hollow, they immediately went after the personal guarantees. Cashin and Fallon filed for bankruptcy less than 4 days later. Their sprawling custom-built mansion was seized by the bank. Fallon aggressively filed for divorce, taking whatever scraps were left, and severed all ties with Cashin. But bankruptcy was the absolute least of Cashin's problems. The dossier Theron handed over to the authorities triggered an unstoppable legal avalanche. Cashin was formally indicted on federal charges of wire fraud and identity theft. He was currently out on bail, facing a mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison. And he did not go down alone. The SEC launched a full-scale investigation into Alaric's past banking activities, freezing his retirement accounts. My parents were facing their twilight years with a fraction of their wealth and the crushing realization that they had sacrificed their only successful child for a criminal. I never answered their desperate phone calls. I never read their tearful, begging letters. I simply deleted the voicemails and instructed my security team to turn them away at the gate. The boundary I established was a permanent, impenetrable wall. However, there was one final, microscopic loose end I needed to tie up. A purely symbolic detail required to close this chapter forever. Years ago, before the Delaware C Corp and the millions, my father had mockingly handed me a check for $5,000 to buy my first industrial sewing machine. He called it pity money. He never asked for equity for that specific check, writing it off as the cheap cost of maintaining his superiority complex. The week after Cashin's federal indictment became public knowledge, I took a trip to my private bank. I requested a certified cashier's check made out to Alaric for exactly $5,000. I slipped it inside a heavy white envelope. I did not include a letter. I simply took a piece of premium cardstock and wrote 3 words in sharp black ink, paid in full. I paid a private courier to hand-deliver it directly to the cramped, cheap apartment my parents were now forced to rent. Handing it back was never about the money. It was about cleanly severing the very last string they believed they had attached to my life. It was the ultimate declaration of my absolute independence. People often misunderstand the true nature of vengeance. We are conditioned to believe that revenge must be a loud, violently dramatic spectacle. But true revenge is simply stepping aside, securing your borders, and allowing arrogant people to sign their own destruction using the pen of their own bottomless greed. Now, I want to turn this conversation over to you. Have you ever let someone's greed become their own trap? Have you ever had to walk away from the people who were supposed to protect you to finally find your own peace? Cutting ties with toxic family is a heartbreaking, exhausting process, but it is also the most liberating step you can ever take. Please share your experience in the comments below. Your stories matter, and you are absolutely not alone. If this journey resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who might need a reminder of their own power right now. Keep building your fortress, protect your peace fiercely, and I will see you all in the next video.